React context. We'll understand about context and why is it necessary. Then we'll see about how to create the context and how to use the context. Okay, so to set the code playground for today's session, you need to run this command and then run npm install. With this, all the dependencies will get installed. Okay, so let's get started. So to understand the context, we are going to take an example of the Windows website. Okay, you can see there on the top we have a drop down option of different languages. So based on the language selection, the content is being updated appropriately. Okay, so you can see there once we choose Hindi, so appropriately the content is being updated to the Hindi language. Right there you can see appropriately the content is being updated based on the language of our choice. Right, this is a very common feature in a lot of websites. You can take Facebook, you can take Google. Right, so based on the language of our choice, the application content will change. Right, this is a very common feature. So we are going to take this example and understand about context. Okay, so firstly let's get a brief understanding about this example. Okay, so you can see that within the app component we have header, landing section and features section. Okay, these are the three. Header on the top with the drop down, and then we have the landing section, then we have the feature section, and within the feature section there is playtime and new ways to connect. These are the two other components within the features section. Okay, now to understand the hierarchy, so within the app component we have the header, landing section and feature section, and within the feature section we have the playtime and new ways to connect. So this is the hierarchy of the current application. Okay, so the initial code related to all these components are available for you. So for each and every component, the corresponding code is already available for you. So once you do CCBP start, you will be able to look into the initial code of these components. Now let's get a brief understanding about the code that is present. Okay, starting with the app component. So here you can see that within the app component in the render method, we have the header, landing section and feature section. Okay, and now coming to the feature section, within the feature section we have the playtime and new ways to connect, as we understood the hierarchy, right? So if you run npm start, you will be able to see this output. Okay, yeah, there you can see that on the top we have the drop down, and based on the language choice, appropriately the content is being updated. Okay, so once go through the initial code that is being provided to you and observe the component structure and also the state that is being maintained and the props that are being passed to the various components. Get a brief understanding about the initial code that is being provided to you. Okay, you can pause the video here and get a brief understanding about the code provided to you. I hope you have gone through the initial code. Let me give you a brief understanding of the initial code. So here you can see that in the app component, we are maintaining the active language in this state, right? So the reason here is the active language changes over the time. So based on the user action, the active language will change, right? If in the drop down he selects Hindi, right, then appropriately in the state, the active language has to be updated to Hindi. And if he selects English, then English, like this, right? So that's the reason we are maintaining the active language in the state. And then you can see that we have a function change language. So where the active language is being passed as an argument and then the state is being updated. Okay, so this is a method that has to be called when the active language has to be updated. So here we are passing the new active language as an argument and then we are updating the state so that the render method will be called and all the components will be re-rendered based on the new active language. So whenever the drop down option changes, so then the change language method should be called so that appropriately we can see the content based on the new option selection. Okay, clear? So if you go through the code, this is very similar to the ones that we have done previously. You'll get an understanding. Okay, now coming to the header, landing section and features section. Let's understand the props that are being passed. So you can see that we are passing the active language to all these three sections. Okay, so the active language is being passed to all the three sections because based on the active language, the content has to be appropriately displayed, right? If it is English, we have to show English content. If it is Hindi, we have to show Hindi content, right? So that's the reason we are passing the active language as a prop to all the three components. You can see that. At the same time, we are passing the change language also as a prop to the header component. So the reason here is that in the header component, we have the drop down where the active language selection can change over the time. So this method has to be called. So we are passing this as a prop so that appropriately the state can be updated and all the components can be re-rendered. Okay, so you have understood about the props that are being passed. Right, now coming to the next. So here let's understand about the header component, right? That's on the top, you can see that. So in the header component, you can see that the active language and change language are being passed as props. So as we have previously seen in the app component, we are passing the active language and change language as props and we are accessing them in the header component. And then you can see that in the select component, you can see the select element. So there we are setting the value as active language. That is the current selection. So that's the reason we are setting the value as active language. And in case there's a change in the drop-down selection, then on change event will be triggered. So then you can see that the on change language method will be called. Within that, we are calling the change language. so that the state will be updated with the new active language and all the components will get re-rendered with the updated active language, right? So this is what happens here in the header component. Now, coming to the landing section. So landing section is the blue part in between. You can see that Windows 11, that whole logo in this, that is the landing section. So coming to the landing section component, you can see on the top, we have this object. So in this object, so the language and the corresponding content that needs to be displayed is being maintained. You can see that in case of English, the English heading, the English description is being maintained. In case of Hindi, the Hindi heading, the Hindi description is being maintained and so on. Okay, you can see that. So the content is being maintained in this particular object. Okay, now coming to the code, so here you can see that based on the active language, so we are getting the content and we are displaying that. You can see from props we are accessing the active language, and then we are calling the get landing section data method where we are passing the active language, and based on the active language we are getting the content, and then we are displaying that content here in the written, you can see within that JSX elements. Okay, so this is regarding the landing section. Okay, now the next thing is feature section. Even in feature section, you can see that we are accessing the active language from the props, and then you can see here we are just having playtime and new ways to connect. So we are just passing this active language to the playtime and the new ways to connect components as props. Okay, you can see that. So the feature section is receiving the active language as a prop from the app component, and it's passing this active language to the playtime and new ways to connect. Okay, so I have given you a brief understanding about the code that is present in the various components. Okay, let me just show it to you. Okay. So here you can see within the source we have app.js. In app.js you can see in the state we have active language, we have the change language method where we are updating the state based on the active language, we are updating the state. Okay, and then here in the render method we are accessing the active language and we are passing that as props. Here you can see that to the header component, to the landing section and feature section, right? And then change language is also being passed to the header. Now coming to the header component, you can see the code available. So in the header component, we are passing the active language and change language as props, right? So now in the select element, you can see the value is set as active language, right? So that is a current selected option. So we have set that. And in case of change in the drop-down selection, on change event will be triggered, then this method will be called, right? Then the change language which has been passed as a prop is called. So then in the app component, so we have the change language. So this dot change language, you can see here, this function will be called. The state will be updated with the new option selection, and then you can see once the state has been updated, the render method will be called and all the components will be re-rendered and the entire component will be updated. Okay, so all the components will get updated with the new language option. Okay. So here you can see we understood about the header component. Okay, coming to the various other components, say landing section, right? So here you can see there is an object landing section content where based on the language, the appropriate content is being maintained here. So for English, you can see the English content. For Hindi, it's Hindi content. For Telugu, it's Telugu content. Okay, and then you can see that in the landing section, so the active language is being passed as a prop, right? And based on the active language, so here you can see in the get landing section data, the active language is passed as an argument, and then we are getting the appropriate content here based on the language. And then we got the heading and description, and we are displaying that finally here. Okay, so similarly, the playtime, new ways to connect, all these components work in the same way. There's an object in which the content is being maintained based on the language, and then so based on the active language that is being passed as a prop, so we'll choose the content that needs to be displayed and we'll render that content. Okay, that is how it works. Now coming to the features section. Okay, so in features section, you can see that the active language is being passed as a prop. Okay, and then here we don't need the active language as such for features section. We are just getting this active language so that we can take it forward and send it to playtime and new ways to connect components, because active language is necessary for playtime and new ways to connect, because there we have to display the content based on the language. So just to pass on this active language to playtime and new ways to connect, we are passing this to the features section. Okay, passing the active language to the features section as a prop. You can see that we are accessing the active language and we are passing it down to the playtime and the new ways to connect. Okay, clear? So we got a brief understanding and we have seen this output based on the selection of language appropriately the content is being updated, right? Okay. So now let's proceed further. So we understood that here in header, landing section, feature section, playtime, new ways to connect, for all these components, the active language is being passed as a prop, right? So here, if you observe the feature section especially, so in case of the feature section, So the active language prop is being passed to it so that it can pass it forward to playtime and new ways to connect. As such, in the features section, we are not making use of the active language. We are not making use of that data in the features section. So the app component is sending this active language as a prop to the features section so that it can send it down the hierarchy to playtime and new ways to connect. That's it. So the data is not being used in the features section, right? So this is called prop drilling. So if you observe the code here in the feature section component, so the active language is being passed as a prop. We are accessing it and we are sending that as a prop to playtime and new ways to connect. As such, we are not making use of this data. As such, we are not making use of active language here, right? Just so that we can pass it down to the child components, we are sending it as a prop to the feature section, right? So in the hierarchy, just so that we have to pass it to playtime and new ways to connect. So only for that reason, we are passing the data to the feature section. This is called prop drilling. That is passing props from one component to another component, though they don't need that data, just so that they can be sent down the tree to the child components. This is called prop drilling. Okay, so here you can see that here the child components are playtime and new ways to connect. So these two components need active language, right? So just so that the active language is passed to these two components, not being used by the features section, right? This is called prop drilling. So prop drilling is an issue when the application grows, when there's a huge hierarchy, different components, right? So in such scenarios, the prop drilling would be an issue. Okay, the reason is that somewhere down, some child components need some data. Let's say that data is maintained in the state somewhere on the top. Now, to send that data from the top to the child components, it has to be passed through various other components so that it can reach the child components. The number of props that have to be passed will increase, right? Unnecessary data has to be passed to different components. And in case if we want to make a small change, then the change should be reflected in various other components, right? So though the data is not being used in that component, still we have to make a change and we have to pass it to that component. All this will become complex. So prop drilling would be an issue as the application grows, right? So the question here is there any better method so that the data is available to the child components, but there is no necessity of passing it to all the components in between? You can see that the data is somewhere in the state, somewhere on the top. So instead of involving all the components in between, can we make the data available for the children? Okay, that's the question. Is it possible? Yes. So the solution here is the React context. Context is a mechanism to make the data available to all the components. So using this, we can make a particular data available for all the components. Let's understand about it. So firstly, to create context, we have to write react.createContext of, and we'll provide the initial value for the context. Okay, this will return an object with different properties using which we can update the context value, we can access the context value. Okay, so let's take our example, the Windows example. So here we want to create a context. So firstly, we'll create a folder context parallel to the components in which we are going to maintain the various contexts that we want to maintain. So firstly, we want to have some language context. So there you can see we have the language context.js. So within that, you can see that we have firstly imported React. Then we have written react.createContext of, and we have to provide the initial value to it. Okay, so this will return an object. Okay, that is language context. Okay, so now let's understand the initial value that we have provided. So firstly, we want the active language to be available for all the components, right? So we are maintaining that in the context. So you can see that it's an object with a key as active language and the initial value is English. Okay, now we are also maintaining change language, which is a method. Using this method, we'll update the active language. So we'll understand about this later on. Okay. Clear? So here we are creating a context. So firstly, we have to import React. We have to write react.createContext of, and we have to provide some initial value, which is an object with the active language and change language. This will return an object, context object, that is language context. And we are exporting this so that we can make use of this context. There you can see export default language context. We are exporting it so that we can make use of this. Okay. Now, so we have the language context with the active language and change language. Now this language context is available for all the components. Okay, so let us create this language context first. Okay, so I'll just close these off. So now, let's create the context. So parallel to components, so I'll create a new folder. Okay, let me call that context. Okay, now within this, I can add all the contexts that I have to maintain. So firstly, I want to maintain language context. So new file, language context.js. Okay, so here within this, we are going to create the context. So to create the context, we have to make use of React. So let me import that. Import React from React. Okay, So now React dot create context of, and we'll provide the initial value. So coming to the initial value, we want the active language and the change language to be present. So with we are passing an object as an initial value. You can see that there. In that, the first key is active language, and I'm initializing it with English. Now the next thing is change language. So for now, I'm having an empty function. Later on, I will update this. Okay. So this is the context that I have created. Okay. Now let me, this will actually return an object, right? Let me store that. Okay. So let me say language context. So this is the context object that has been created. So I'm going to store that here in the language context variable, and let me export it so that I can make use of it. Okay. Export default language context. Okay. Clear? So done. We have written this code, right? So we are done creating the context, right? There you can see we have written react.create context. We have created the context with active language and change language. And then we have exported it also so that we can make use of in the components that are necessary. Okay. So this is done. Right. Now, here, the context object will have two properties, consumer and provider, using which we can access the context value and update the context value. Now we are done creating the context. The next step would be, we have to access this context value, right? Instead of props, we want to access this context value. So for that, we are going to make use of the consumer. Okay, this is a property that is available with the context object. Okay, so using this, we can access the value in the context. Okay, so this consumer is actually a component. It's a property of the context object. At the same time, it's a component that is provided by the context object. The syntax of this. So to access this consumer component, you have to write the context object dot and then the consumer. So this will give us the consumer component of that context object. Okay, we'll make use of this dot notation here. Context object dot consumer. Okay, so within that, we'll have a callback function. Okay, firstly, to access the context value, we'll make use of the consumer component, right? So here, to access the consumer component, you have to write context object dot consumer. That will give you the consumer component. Now, within that consumer component, we'll have a callback function. So the value of the context will be passed as an argument to this callback function. Okay, so you can see that within the consumer component, we'll have a callback function, and the value, the context value, will be passed as an argument to this callback function. Okay, so here in our case, in case of the language context, so firstly, to write the consumer component, we have to write language context. That is a context object that we have exported, right? So language context dot consumer. Okay, so that is a consumer component. Within that, we have to have a callback function. There you can see, to which the context value will be passed as an argument. You can see we have value there, and within the callback function, you can see that we are accessing the active language and change language from the value, right? So this is how it is done. So we have to access the consumer component, and there'll be a callback function. Within that, you can access the context value, which is passed as an argument. Okay, clear? Now, let's apply this. So firstly, let's access this context value in the header component. Okay, we'll start with the header component and access the context value in the header component. Okay, so for now, in the code of a header component, so we have the props, and from props, we are accessing the active language and change language, right? So you can see that there. So now what we'll do is, we will access this active language and change language from the context. So to access the context value, we have to make use of the consumer component. So there you can see we have added the code related to that. So you can see language context.consumer, then the callback function, value, and from value, we are accessing the active language and change language. Okay, clear? Now, the question here is, we have got the active language and the change language from the context value. Now the code related to this should also be moved into that callback function, right? So because whatever pieces of code uses this active language and change language, they have to be moved inside this callback function. That is where the active language and change language are available, right? Now we are getting it through the context value. So they are available inside the callback function. So whatever code uses this active language and change language, it has to be moved inside the callback function. So the code that is using this active language and change language is firstly on change language, where we are using the change language, and the written JSX part, where we are making use of active language. We are moving this into the consumer component. Okay, there you can see, right? Okay. So here, now there is no necessity of props. So let's just get rid of the props. So now there's no need of passing the active language and change language as props. So we are removing the code related to that, and also the props that are being passed as an argument is being removed. Okay, there you can see. Another important point here is, so there you can see that instead of the curly braces, we have moved it into the rounded braces, because that is a component that is being written. Okay, so now let's understand about this and implement this. Okay. So firstly, we want to make use of this language context in the header component, right? Okay. So going to the header component, right? So here you can see that for now, so the props are being passed. So there is active language and change language, and we are making use of them here in the code, right? Now, instead of this, we are going to have the consumer, okay, where we'll access the context value and appropriately we'll write the code, okay? So for that, we have to first import the context object, right? So let me do that. So import language context from /context. So we are currently in header, so dot dot slash, then we'll finally go into the context, right? So you can see there's context, and then within the context we have the language context, right? So we are done here. So we have the language context. So this is a context object. Now let's write the consumer. So the notation is the context object dot consumer, okay? So we have written that. So within this we'll have a callback function. So in this callback function, so the value will be passed as an argument to the callback function. There you can see, right? Okay. So now, in this, firstly, we have to access the context, right? So what are the things that we want to access? Active language and change language. So constant, active language, change language from the context value. We are accessing that. Okay. So now, the next thing is all the code snippets that are making use of active language and change language have to be moved inside the callback, because these values are present inside this callback function, right? It's present inside this. So the code that is using these values should also be moved inside. Okay, so what is the code? Here you can see that coming to the active language, it's being used here, and the change language is being used here. So all this part of code has to be moved inside. Okay, so I'm removing it from here and I'm adding it here. Okay, so done. So here we are done with adding this. Okay, all the code related to that active language and change language has been moved here. And now we no longer need the props because we are making use of the context. So let me eliminate this. Okay, and there's no need of props being passed, so I'm going to remove that too. Okay, so we are done with this. Now the question here is, so you can see that within this consumer component, within this callback function, we are returning the JSX element, right? So here currently we have this component, okay, and this component has to be returned, right? So here you can see the consumer component is here, okay, and within the consumer component you can see that we are returning the we have the callback where we are returning this JSX element, and finally this header component has to return this JSX element, right? So what do we have to do? Simple, we just have to return this component. Okay, so if you return this entire consumer component, so in the consumer component we are returning the JSX, so finally the JSX will be returned by the header. Okay, so this is the only thing present. So what we can do is we can simplify it in this manner. Okay, so I hope you understood this concept. So here what we are doing is that, so firstly in the consumer component we have accessed the context value, and all the code related to this context value has been moved inside, and even the return statement, the return JSX part is also being moved inside. So this entire header component has to return this JSX, right? So here, since we have the consumer component and that is returning this, we are directly returning this consumer component, which will in turn return this JSX. Okay, so that's what we have done. Okay, clear? So we are done with this. So now, clear, right? So this part. So there you can see we are done with this, right? Now, the final step is, since we no longer need the props to be passed to the header, so we can just get rid of those props being passed through the app component. Okay, so then we can test it in this manner. You can change the active language that we have passed to the language context, and appropriately we can see the change in the drop down. Okay, let's see it. So firstly, as we understood, so from the app component, we no longer need to pass these as props, right? So we just have to mention the header component here. No need of passing props, right? That's what we are trying to achieve, right? Okay. So here you can see currently we have English. Now in the language context, let me change the initial value. Currently it's English, so that's the reason we have seen English. Now let me change it to Hindi, and you can see that in the drop down, the currently selected option is Hindi. So the header component, that's where we have made use of the context, right? And then it's been appropriately updated, right? So based on the choice. So here you write English. So here it's updated to English. If you write Hindi, it will be updated to Hindi. There you can see. Okay, clear? Cool. So we have seen these outputs also, right? Okay. Now we have made use of the language context in the header component, right? So now let's use the context value in the playtime component also. Okay. So here you can see that we have the playtime component there. That is a part, that is the playtime component. So let's make use of this language context in the playtime component. Okay. So in the playtime component, you can see on the top we have the content. So based on the language, the appropriate content is maintained in that object. And then within the component, you can see that we have a method get playtime data based on the active language. So the playtime content will be returned from there, and we are appropriately adding them in the JSX and we are returning. Okay. So now let's include context here. Instead of props, let's make use of the context here. Okay. So here you can see that firstly we are importing the language context, right? There you can see that. And then to access the context value, you have to make use of the consumer component. So language context.consumer. Within that, we'll have a callback function, that is a syntax, right? The context value will be passed as an argument. You can see we have written value there. And from the context, we just need the active language. So we are accessing the active language. Simple, right? The same steps that we have done in the header component case. The same things we have to replicate here. Firstly, the consumer component, callback function, accessing the context value. Now, let's move the code that is making use of the active language. So firstly, you can see that there is get playtime data of active language. So that's where we are making use of active language. That's giving us heading and description. And then the heading and description are being used in the written JSX part. So we have to move that also into the callback. So there you can see we are done moving that into it. Okay. Now there's no need of props, so we can get rid of it. There you can see we are getting rid of it. And then finally, as we have previously understood, so here the callback function is returning the JSX. And that has to be finally returned by the playtime. Currently, we have the consumer component. So we have to return the consumer component so that it will in turn return the JSX. So we are writing the return statement for that. Okay. Clear? So simple, right? So let's just try this out. So now in the playtime, okay, so let's start using the context. So here you can see that in this object, so based on the language, appropriate content is being maintained here. And this is a method. So based on the active language, the corresponding content is being returned by this method. So the heading and the description. And then the heading and the description are appropriately being rendered here in this. We have this JSX element. That's where we are using it. Okay. Now, instead of using props, you can see that from the props, we are getting the active language. Now we want to eliminate this. So instead of using props, so let's make use of the context. Okay. Firstly, we have to import it. Import language context from /context/ language context. Okay, so this is the context object. Now, to access a value, you have to write language context.consumer. So that is a component. Within that, we'll have a callback function to which the context value will be passed as an argument. And we can access the context through this value. Okay, so for now, we just want the active language. So I'm accessing that from the context. Okay, now, so now, next, we have to move the code that makes use of this active language, right? Because active language is available here. So the code that uses this active language should be moved in here. So active language is being used here. You can see that. Okay. So let me just move this here. Okay. So now I have moved this part into this callback function, which is giving me heading and description. Again, I'm using heading and description in this return JSX part, right? So we need heading and description available for this part. So let's move this also into the callback function. So you understood, right? Since heading and description have been moved inside the callback function, so that's the reason we have to also move this return JSX part into the callback function. Okay. So we are done with this. So all the code related to this active language have been moved into this callback function. Right. Now we no longer need these props. Okay. So I'm just getting rid of that. So this is also not necessary. Okay. This step is also done. Okay. So now, this playtime has to return this JSX part, right? This entire JSX has to be returned by this playtime component. But currently, we just have a consumer component here, right? And the consumer component is returning this JSX. So now what do we have to do? We have to return this consumer component, right? So this is very important. So there's a very high chance that we miss this while writing. So it's important that you ensure that you write a written statement here. So the reason here is the consumer component is returning the JSX and this playtime has to return the JSX. So we have to return this consumer component. It's like return of return. So this is returning the JSX. Then if you write a return, so that will finally return the JSX through this playtime. Okay, done, right? We are done using the context inside the playtime component. Okay, so you can see here. So now let's change the language to say English. Okay, and you can see that now we have English here in the playtime component. Okay, if it's Hindi, we'll have the Hindi content. Okay, so here we have appropriately made use of the context and we have seen the output, right? Okay. So we have seen this. Then as we know that there's no need of passing the active language as prop, let's just remove that. So in the features section, that's where we have the playtime component, right? So let me just go to the features section, right? So there's no need of passing this active language as a prop. So let me just remove it. Okay. So you can still see the output. So we are just getting rid of that prop. Okay, that's what we are trying to do, right? Okay, so here you can see this outputs that we already have seen. So we have changed the context value, and appropriately we can see that the playtime content has been appropriately updated. So in case of Hindi, we have seen this, right? Okay. So now we have made use of the language context in the header component and also in the playtime component, right? Similarly, what you could do is you can see how you can make use of the language context in the landing section and in the new ways to connect. It's very similar, right? So just try to implement them in the landing section and the new ways to connect. So far we understood about how to make use of the context value, right? Let's just include them into the landing section and new ways to connect. Okay, so just by adding the consumer component into new ways to connect and landing section, so the advantage here is, so from the features section, we can completely eliminate the passing of active language into it. Okay, you can see that. So just like how we got this active language removed as a prop from playtime, similarly, if you implement the consumer component in the new ways to connect, then we'll get rid of the active language prop being passed to the new ways to connect. So there's no longer necessary of the active language being passed to the playtime and new ways to connect. So then there's no need of passing the active language to the features section, right? So that's the advantage here. There's no necessity of passing the active language to the features section since the playtime and new ways to connect are using the context. Okay, this is how we'll eliminate the prop drilling using the context, right? Okay. So even in case of landing section and features section, you can see that we can just get rid of them. Okay, and we'll just have header, landing section and features section. Okay, so do implement this consumer component in the landing section and also in the new ways to connect. Then you will understand about how we have eliminated the problem of prop drilling. Okay, so here what you could do is you can use the below command, there you can see, to check the final code, okay, where we have used the context and eliminated the prop drilling problem. Okay, just run this and you'll be able to see this output. So let me show it to you. So I'll just go to the terminal. So let me do CCVP start. So we'll see the final code now. Okay. So firstly, we have the context, which we have already seen about it, right? And then coming to the components, right? So you can see that we'll start off with the app.js. So here you can see that we are not passing active language as props to any of these. Okay, so there's no necessity at all. So in fact, there's no need of writing this statement too. So we are not making use of this anymore here. Okay. Now, coming to the features section, that's where we have seen the problem of prop drilling, right? You can see that to the features section, we no longer have to pass the active language as a prop. And in the features section, you can see that we no longer have to pass these, right? And then even in the new ways to connect, you can see that just by using the language context, we can appropriately implement everything. Okay, clear? So you can see that there's no need of passing the active language as props to it, right? And even for the features section, and then you can see for new ways to connect also where how we have made use of the context, right? So we have eliminated the prop drilling, right? Because active language is not necessary in the feature section and we are not passing it to it also, right? Only the data that is necessary is being maintained and used in the components itself. Okay, clear? So using context, we have eliminated the prop drilling and we were able to easily access the values without passing them as props. Here, one important point to note is that we'll make use of the context when there's a problem of props drilling and a particular data has to be available for a lot of components. Like here in our case, the active language has to be available for header, landing section, playtime, new ways to connect. So that's the reason we have maintained it in the context. When a particular data is necessary for a lot of components and there is a prop drilling problem, only then we'll make use of this context. Okay. So we have seen these outputs also, right? So you can just try it out using the final code. You'll be able to see these outputs. Now, another point to note here is that if you try to change the language in the dropdown, the output will not be reflected appropriately, right? So here you can see if we even select Hindi, right? Even then, so we won't have the Hindi content. The reason here is the change language in the context is currently an empty function. So that's the reason. So here the content has appropriately not been updated, okay? Once we update it appropriately, so it will get reflected. Okay, so here since the function is an empty function, so the change has not been triggered and the language has not been updated. So to test it out, you can just update the initial value that we have set in the context and you can see the output. So we'll cover about this in the next session. So to update the value of the context, there is a special component called provider. So we'll understand about this provider in the next session. Okay, so in today's session, we understood about context and why is it necessary. It will eliminate the prop drilling issue, right? And we have seen how to create the context, right? And then we have seen how to access the context value using the consumer component, right? In the next session, we'll continue about this context and understand about the provider component.